Sirens keened as screens bled red, and Jonathan Kane said, "Who pulled the pin on my company?" The boardroom thrummed like a struck nerve while Daniel Reed said, "We need containment now." Michael Grant smoothed his sleeve and said, "It flags an internal breach." Richard Cole appeared on a wall feed and said, "Markets abhor weakness, Jonathan." Emily Parker hugged a tablet and said, "PR channels are melting down." Charles Whitmore said, "Ambition always arrives with a bill." Victoria Steele said, "Stability is all investors buy." Sarah Jennings said, "People are already packing boxes." Lucas Meyer glanced down and said, "Traffic suggests someone inside is streaming." Jonathan said, "Lock every door, freeze every route, and find the hand on my throat." Marble echoed under quick steps as Jonathan Kane said, "They want a head on a plate." Emily Parker kept pace and said, "Social feels like a riot in a matchbox." Daniel Reed joined and said, "Audit trails show a ghost in finance." Michael Grant said, "Legal advises a controlled burn." Sarah Jennings passed them and said, "People think the ship already sank." Charles Whitmore said, "Pick what you can afford to lose." Victoria Steele rang in and said, "Confidence is a number with feelings." Lucas Meyer lagged behind and said, "Backchannel traffic spikes near payroll." Richard Cole trended across a lobby screen and said, "Empires collapse politely, then completely." Jonathan said, "No collapses today, not mine." The elevator doors parted to a press scrum that smelled like hot lights and panic, and Jonathan Kane said one statement, "Then I fixed the fire." Cameras surged as Emily Parker said, "Keep it clipped and human." Richard Cole's quote crawled across a ticker, while Michael Grant said, "Blame the system, not the helm." Daniel Reed said, "We can verify nothing without time." Sarah Jennings said, "They only hear blood." Charles Whitmore said, "There is power in owning the wound." Victoria Steele said, "Investors accept pain when it is priced." Lucas Meyer said another leak dropped mid-sentence. Jonathan faced the lenses and said, "I built this, and I will answer for it." Back upstairs the glass felt thinner, and Jonathan Kane said, "Show me the breach map." Daniel Reed dragged windows into constellations and said, "The needle sits in Treasury." Michael Grant said, "Treasury logs rotate hourly, which is tidy." Emily Parker said, "We can pivot the narrative to sabotage." Sarah Jennings said, "Staff think the rot is higher than the vents." Charles Whitmore said, "Do not chase ghosts with torches." Victoria Steele said, "I prefer numbers to alibis." Lucas Meyer said, "A user with admin signed in from a conference room." Richard Cole trended again and said, "Silence is confession." Jonathan said, "Seal the floor and count every fingerprint." Night never fully left the windows, and Jonathan Kane said, "If trust dies, the company dies first." Daniel Reed said, "I can lock Treasury, but I need signatures." Michael Grant said, "You will have them, as always." Emily Parker said, "Media wants a face to blame by noon." Sarah Jennings said, "They will take yours because it fits the poster." Charles Whitmore said, "Choose a truth before they choose one for you." Victoria Steele said, "I can hold the line for 1/4. Lucas Meyer said, "The admin token just moved to a boardroom device." Richard Cole's face returned to the screen and said, "Your empire twitches." Jonathan said, "Then I cut the hand that makes it twitch." Tension curdled in the air as Jonathan Kane said, "I want to know who breathes doubt in my house." Daniel Reed said, "Board whispers grow by the hour." Michael Grant said, "Loyalty is never a fixed currency." Emily Parker said, "Teams watch every flicker of your face." Sarah Jennings said, "Morale slides faster than markets." Charles Whitmore said, "You hold power by making others believe they have none." Victoria Steele said, "Doubt corrodes margins more than debt." Richard Cole's feed returned and said, "Even allies hedge their bets." Lucas Meyer said, "Traffic spikes in executive chat rooms suggest plotting." Jonathan said, "If alliances fracture, I decide where the cracks fall." In the glass-walled lounge, Jonathan Kane said, "He circles like a shark because blood fills the water." Richard Cole's voice crackled, "Markets crave predators, not caretakers." Michael Grant said, "He will not strike directly, but hollow you from inside." Emily Parker said, "Every headline makes his shadow larger." Daniel Reed said, "We can firewall contracts but not whispers." Sarah Jennings said, "Staff repeat his name more than yours." Charles Whitmore said, "Rivals sharpen knives on the dull edge of silence." Victoria Steele said, "Cole buys rumors faster than stocks." Lucas Myers said, "Backchannel logs show his legal team feeding the press." Jonathan said, "Then we starve him before he feeds." In a quiet office corner, Daniel Reed said, "You taught me loyalty, Jonathan, but I see you doubt mine." Jonathan Kane said, "I doubt everyone until I can't afford to." Emily Parker said, "Whispers say Daniel leaks." Michael Grant said, "Divided confidence end kingships." Sarah Jennings said, "Morale craters when insiders fracture." Charles Whitmore said, "Trust dies more slowly than ambition, but still dies." Victoria Steele said, "I watch your circle shrink with every update." Richard Cole's image scrolled with headlines and said, "Even your oldest guard falters." Lucas Myers said, "Audit tags Daniel's ID near the breach." Jonathan said, "If Daniel betrays me, the heart already failed." A shadow lingered near the corner, and Jonathan Kane said, "Not every enemy sits across the table." Sarah Jennings said, "Whispers say spies bleed data out daily." Michael Grant said, "Better a spy than a traitor in plain sight." Daniel Reed said, "We must audit every keystroke." Emily Parker said, "If word spreads, panic doubles." Charles Whitmore said, "A company becomes porous long before it knows." Victoria Steele said, "Leaks cost more than acquisitions." Richard Cole's face grinned from a breaking news feed and said, "Your walls drip faster than mine." Lucas Myers said, "I see patterns no one else checks." Jonathan said, "Root them out before silence costs more." In the silent boardroom, Jonathan Kane said, "We bleed, but I refuse collapse." Michael Grant said, "To fight back means revealing cards." Daniel Reed said, "Containment means sacrifice." Emily Parker said, "Media frenzy feeds until nothing's left." Sarah Jennings said, "Workers already sign exit letters." Charles Whitmore said, "Power survives by burning pawns." Victoria Steele said, "If I withdraw, your empire folds." Richard Cole's statement scrolled, "The kingdom is rotting." Lucas Meyer said, "Evidence trails point at familiar hands." Jonathan said, "Then I turn fracture into a weapon and cut deeper than them all." In a dim operations floor, Jonathan Kane said, "Eyes overlook the quiet ones." Emily Parker said, "She listens more than she speaks." Michael Grant said, "Underdogs grow teeth when ignored." Daniel Reed said, "Her loyalty is a question unasked." Sarah Jennings said, "Whispers say she could rise if pushed." Charles Whitmore said, "Never underestimate silence. It builds storms." Victoria Steele said, "Even underestimated assets can tilt the balance." Richard Cole's headline scrolled, "A new player rises." Lucas Meyer said, "Audit trails suggest Emily saw more than she admits." Jonathan said, "If she is power hidden, then I choose if she blooms or burns." Numbers scrolled like threats across darkened screens, and Jonathan Kane said, "Who funds the storm outside?" Victoria Steele's voice cut cold. "I shape tides unseen." Michael Grant said, "Investors dictate your lifeline." Emily Parker said, "Her voice changes rooms she never enters." Daniel Reed said, "Every call she makes erodes your grip." Sarah Jennings said, "Employees sense a hand they cannot see." Charles Whitmore said, "Money is a leash tied around every neck." Richard Cole said, "She props you up until she profits from collapse." Lucas Myers said, "Encrypted calls trace back to her proxy." Jonathan said, "If her shadow grows, I drag it into light." In the hushed archive room, Charles Whitmore said, "Ambition is a pyre that consumes faster than it builds." Jonathan Kane said, "I will not be your echo." Michael Grant said, his ruin speaks louder than advice. Emily Parker said, he carries the weight of failure in his eyes. Daniel Reed said, every warning has truth hidden beneath resentment. Sarah Jennings said, mentors project their own collapse onto you. Victoria Steele said, he plays caution while buying silence. Richard Cole's voice on an old recording said, Whitmore fell because he blinked. Lucas Myers said, archived files reveal his missteps. Jonathan said, I will learn without repeating. News feeds erupted in red banners, and Jonathan Kane said, he strikes in public, not shadows. Richard Cole's broadcast blared, your empire buckles. Michael Grant said, he poisons with truth twisted. Emily Parker said, every outlet repeats his words. Daniel Reed said, containment grows harder with noise, louder than reason. Sarah Jennings said, employees read headlines more than memos. Charles Whitmore said, public opinion turns faster than capital. Victoria Steele said, Cole thrives when panic outweighs trust. Lucas Myers said, feeds spread faster than we can block. Jonathan said, if war comes public, I fight on their stage, not his. As storms pounded glass, Jonathan Kane said, one gamble decides survival. Michael Grant said, a gamble loses more than it gains. Emily Parker said, every risk carries blood. Daniel Reed said, strategic sacrifice buys time. Sarah Jennings said, morale collapses with every reckless choice. Charles Whitmore said, desperation makes you blind to cost. Victoria Steele said, investors, watch your every turn. Richard Cole's feed flashed, collapse becomes entertainment. Lucas Myers said, firewalling treasury requires a burn. Jonathan said, then burn it, I will not die quietly. The conference room dimmed as rain blurred the skyline, and Jonathan Kane said, masks always crack if pressure climbs high enough. Michael Grant said, cracks reveal strength or betrayal. Daniel Reed said, treasuries, breach ties back to someone internal. Emily Parker said, every trace I follow circles back to Michael. Sarah Jennings said, whispers say, trust is a lie repeated until believed. Charles Whitmore said, the knife closest to you cuts deepest. Victoria Steele said, investors whisper your ally is unreliable. Richard Cole's broadcast flashed, Kane's team splinters. Lucas Myers said, logs prove Michael's fingerprints touch forbidden files. Jonathan's stare tightened and said, then the betrayal already began. In the operations pit, Jonathan Kane said, even small voices can shift storms. Emily Parker said, I'm not small, Jonathan. I see more than you allow. Michael Grant said she overstates her reach. Daniel Reed said, her knowledge is dangerous if ignored. Sarah Jennings said, the staff follow her whispers when leaders stumble. Charles Whitmore said, every empire falls when the underestimated rise. Victoria Steele said, the board eyes her potential quietly. Richard Cole's feed ran with the line, a new heir to Kane's empire emerges. Lucas Myers said, logs show Emily accessed restricted comms. Jonathan's voice hardened, if she rises, it's by my choice, not theirs. In a narrow corridor, Daniel Reed said, Jonathan, I stood by you but my conscience fractures. Jonathan Kane said, conscience feeds vultures when shown. Emily Parker said, he struggles because loyalty drowns him. Michael Grant said, confidence questioning kingship bring ruin. Sarah Jennings said, morale suffers when cracks form among trusted ones. Charles Whitmore said, the loyal foil always breaks under strain. Victoria Steele said, doubt sells faster than stock. Richard Cole's headline pulsed, Kane's circle betrays him. Lucas Myers said, Daniel's eye reappeared in breach logs. Jonathan said, if Daniel falters, I cut him before the rival does. The boardroom screens lit with breaking headlines, and Jonathan Kane said, truths unravel here. Richard Cole sneered through broadcast, your empire collapses under friendly fire. Michael Grant said, lies, all of them, Emily Parker whispered, "Logs prove otherwise." Daniel Reed said, "The breach originated near this very table." Sarah Jennings said, "Even staff know the traitor sits with you." Charles Whitmore said, "Confessions echo louder in public halls." Victoria Steele said, "The market rewards brutal clarity." Lucas Myers said, "Patterns confirm Michael's access path." Jonathan slammed the table and said, "The betrayal is not rumor, it is flesh beside me." The silence that followed felt colder than the storm outside, and Jonathan Kane said, "The blade I trusted now twists against me." Michael Grant said, "Power belongs to those who seize it." Emily Parker said, "Jonathan, he's been orchestrating all along." Daniel Reed said, "Every sign pointed here, but we looked away." Sarah Jennings said, "Betrayal always comes from within." Charles Whitmore said, "The cost of ambition is always paid in blood." Victoria Steele said, "Markets already price your fall." Richard Cole crowed, "Your ally becomes your executioner." Lucas Meyer said, "Logs confirm Michael's moves were deliberate." Jonathan's voice broke into fury, "This betrayal ends tonight." The storm had eased, but betrayal thundered louder, and Jonathan Kane said, "The circle collapses, and my ally drinks with my rival." Michael Grant said, "You built this empire, Jonathan, but I deserve the throne." Emily Parker said, "He signed documents with Cole's imprint." Daniel Reed said, "The breach was never sabotage, it was orchestration." Sarah Jennings said, "Staff whisper of a new master at the helm." Charles Whitmore said, "Your empire eats itself from the inside." Victoria Steele said, "Markets adore clean coups." Richard Cole's face filled news feeds and said, "Grant's loyalty belongs to me." Lucas Myers said, "Encrypted channels confirm his alliance." Jonathan roared, "Then the war begins at my table." The hallway echoed with anger, and Sarah Jennings said, "This empire's rot reaches deeper than the board." Jonathan Kane said, "You speak as though you welcome collapse." Michael Grant said, "She sees what you refuse. Your people despise the throne." Emily Parker said, "Morale withers under betrayal's shadow." Daniel Reed said, "Every signature costs another loyalist." Charles Whitmore said, "A jaded voice carries truth. You cannot spin." Victoria Steele said, "Even rebellion reshapes valuation." Richard Cole broadcasted, "Jennings speaks the workers' truth." Web. Lucas Myers said, "Surveys leak showing staff faith below zero." Jonathan's tone hardened, "If rebellion brews, I will face it head-on." Back inside the dim suite, Jonathan Kane said, "A spy bleeds us dry." Lucas Myers said, "The patterns lead to me, but they're planted." Michael Grant said, "Excuses fall hollow when evidence piles." Emily Parker said, "Every log suggests insider sabotage." Daniel Reed said, "Either the spy is Lucas, or he wears the disguise of one." Sarah Jennings said, "Trusting anyone now is a fool's act." Charles Whitmore said, "Spies carve holes before armies storm gates." Victoria Steele said, "Evidence, not excuses, sells stability." Richard Cole sneered on screens, "Your spy will finish you." Jonathan's fury flared. If lies frame Lucas, then someone sharpens daggers in silence. In the archive shadows, Charles Whitmore said, "Collapse smells familiar, Jonathan. I lived it." Jonathan Kane said, "You failed because you surrendered." Michael Grant said, "Mentors cling to ashes, not futures." Emily Parker said, "His warnings ring truer with every hour." Daniel Reed said, "We ignore him while repeating his mistakes." Sarah Jennings said, "His ruin is our mirror." Victoria Steele said, "Caution voiced too late holds no value." Richard Cole mocked on broadcasts, "Whitmore haunts Kane's empire." Lucas Meyer said, "Old files prove Whitmore's fall followed betrayal within." Jonathan's voice cracked with steel, "I will not be the ghost of another man's ruin." The boardroom lights flickered as dawn bled through, and Jonathan Kane said, "This ends when I strike back harder." Michael Grant said, "Every move you make plays into my hand." Emily Parker said, Media flames with every leak he feeds. Daniel Reed said, "We burn treasury funds to block him." Sarah Jennings said, "Workers call this theft from their future." Charles Whitmore said, "Gambles bankrupt faster than wars." Victoria Steele said, "Your survival is the only currency I track." Richard Cole said, "Kane burns his empire to stay alive." Lucas Meyer said, "Treasury firewall triggered, collapse delayed." Jonathan's voice thundered, "I will fight until nothing is left to burn." The trading floor raged like a battlefield, and Jonathan Kane said, "Cole drives his knives through headlines and numbers." Richard Cole appeared smug on every screen and said, "Your empire is mine by morning." Michael Grant said, "This is where loyalty breaks." Emily Parker said, "Media declares a hostile takeover." Daniel Reed said, "I see proxies buying your stock at fever pace." Sarah Jennings said, "Staff say the king already fell." Charles Whitmore said, "Boardroom wars claim more than markets." Victoria Steele said, "Investors cheer the blood sport." Lucas Meyer said, "Digital channels show Cole's hands puppeteering bids." Jonathan slammed his fist and said, "This floor will not be his." Allies peeled away like leaves in a gale, and Jonathan Kane said, "How many betrayals can an empire endure?" Michael Grant said, "They leave because they see survival elsewhere." Emily Parker said, "Half the team signed with Cole already." Daniel Reed said, "Loyalty weighs lighter than fear." Sarah Jennings said, "Your throne empties faster than these halls." Charles Whitmore said, "Every kingdom dies alone." Victoria Steele said, "The market rewards those who abandon ship first." Richard Cole broadcasted, "Even Kane's walls echo hollow." Lucas Meyer said, "Logs show employee exodus in real time." Jonathan's voice cut sharp, "Whoever remains, we fight with them." In the hushed glass chamber, Michael Grant said, "You cannot win because I am already inside your throne." Jonathan Kane said, "Your betrayal won't crown you." Emily Parker said, "He orchestrated every fall." Daniel Reed said, "Proofs bind him to Cole." Sarah Jennings said, "Employees whisper his name more than yours now." Charles Whitmore said, "Allies turned enemies taste victory before the kill." Victoria Steele said, "Grant carries the confidence of a conqueror." Richard Cole said, "Michael is my blade." Lucas Meyer said, "Files expose Grant as the breach's architect." Jonathan's fury tore out. Then I cut out the rot standing before me. The boardroom filled with silence heavier than war. And Jonathan Kane said, "This is where thrones are stolen." Michael Grant said, "No, this is where kings bleed." Emily Parker said, "Markets watch every heartbeat." Daniel Reed said, "His coup is lined in paper and signatures." Sarah Jennings said, "Every staff member already follows him." Charles Whitmore said, "Boardroom duels outlast armies." Victoria Steele said, "Cole's money guarantees his rise." Richard Cole broadcasted, "Signatures confirm your crown is broken." Lucas Meyer said, "Systems log grants authorization override." Jonathan spat fire, "Then the boardroom becomes our battlefield." Jonathan Kane's voice broke through thunder, "If I fall, it will not be quiet." Michael Grant said, "Fall loudly, so the world applauds." Emily Parker said, "Every choice drains the last of us." Daniel Reed said, "Sacrifices leave scars too deep." Sarah Jennings said, "The halls echo your ruin already." Charles Whitmore said, "Ambition demands its final pound of flesh." Victoria Steele said, "Investors crave blood as spectacle." Richard Cole said, "The king dies and the heir takes his crown." Lucas Meyer said, "Treasury firewall buckled under Grant's key." Jonathan's roar cracked. "This empire may burn, but it burns on my terms." The storm cracked like judgment, and Jonathan Kane said, "The mask falls now." Michael Grant laughed. "I was never your ally, only your executioner." Emily Parker said, "He wove every fall into his net." Daniel Reed said, "The breach, the chaos, his fingerprints laced them all." Sarah Jennings said, truth was always here, only buried. Charles Whitmore said, the final betrayal is the cruelest. Victoria Steele said, markets now see him as heir apparent. Richard Cole sneered, your throne is gifted, Grant. Lucas Meyer said, files show his hand from the very first leak. Jonathan's fury erupted, the betrayer stands revealed. The weight of betrayal pressed heavy, and Jonathan Kane said, my empire crumbles because trust was poisoned. Michael Grant said, I hold the crown because you let me close. Emily Parker said, Jonathan, this will break you. Daniel Reed said, your collapse feels inevitable now. Sarah Jennings said, even staff chant his name. Charles Whitmore said, this is the price ambition demands. Victoria Steele said, shareholders rejoice in the coup. Richard Cole said, I wrote the playbook he followed. Lucas Meyer said, the system recognizes Grant as authority. Jonathan's voice cracked, I will not surrender, even broken. The boardroom burned with silence, and Jonathan Kane said, ambition eats everything, even its master. Michael Grant said, your throne is now my stage. Emily Parker said, you win but leave ashes. Daniel Reed said, the cost outweighs the crown. Sarah Jennings said, employees grieve futures already gone. Charles Whitmore said, ambition's feast leaves only bones. Victoria Steele said, profit thrives even on ruin. Richard Cole said, history crowns the bold, not the broken. Lucas Meyer said, logs confirm treasury drained beyond repair. Jonathan whispered like fire dying, ambition devoured us all. The storm outside calmed into gray stillness, and Jonathan Kane said, one final choice defines me. Michael Grant said, choices mean nothing when you've already lost. Emily Parker said, Jonathan, don't destroy yourself. Daniel Reed said, retreat still leaves you dignity. Sarah Jennings said, collapse echoes louder than survival. Charles Whitmore said, choose with the weight of legacy. Victoria Steele said, investors prefer a corpse with clean books. Richard Cole said, one signature heiresses you. Lucas Meyer said, systems await command. Jonathan's final words thundered, then I choose fire over surrender. The silence of ruin filled the room as Jonathan Kane said, if I burn with my empire. Michael Grant said, you would kill the throne to spite me. Emily Parker cried, this ends everything. Daniel Reed said, history will curse this night. Sarah Jennings said, workers lose more than kings. Charles Whitmore said, ambition ends with ash. Victoria Steele said, investors recoil from corpses. Richard Cole howled through feed, he destroys his crown. Lucas Meyer said, systems collapsing under command override. Jonathan's voice cut final, better ashes of my making than a crown of betrayal.